being a church, I understand that we're supposed to be a dispenser of this commodity. Give it away to the world. It's for us to define what it is in the minds of some. Truth is this penultimate thing. There are cartoon characters who climb up mountains to find the wizened priest or old man of the mountain, and they want to find out the truth. We all like the truth. In fact, we're certain that the truth is something fairly simple. And if we can just find the person who has it, and if they could give it to us, our lives would be greatly simplified as well. So we all want truth. And you know what? We even want truth when truth hurts. Because we've learned over the years that as painful as truth can be, lying is more painful. So we'll go for the truth even when we have the conviction that the truth can hurt. So we pursue it. We hunt it. And if truth is all that simple, and if truth is all that evident, then how come truth is so hard to find? How come we can have people on two sides of an aisle that can be completely at odds about what truth consists of? It's like my dad's car. I know he had a blue car, and he knows he had a green car. And Mom knows that they had a turquoise car. And that is just one tiny example of how elusive truth can be. So we look, and we look. But it isn't so much where we look as what we think we're looking for. Half the world, I'll call, we're not talking 49 or 51% here. But there's a lot of people on the planet that think that truth is something. Truth is this, and it is not that. Truth is always true, and anything that is true is never, ever false. And there's a group of people in the world that is certain that truth is something, and what it is, and what it is, isn't, it is not. And that's fairly simple. That's very American. Very popular in America. But there's another group of people that thinks that truth is contextual. What is true depends on where you are, who you are, when you are, and what's going on at the time. This conditional nature of truth is not the popular thing with those who think the truth is not conditional whatsoever. So that which is true in a particular time or place doesn't sit so well with those that think the truth is something. And the idea that truth changes depending on context is very unpopular to the one group. And the idea that truth doesn't the problem with seeking out truth begins with a disagreement about the very nature of the beast. If truth is something immutable, unchangeable, and always the same, then how do you reconcile that to a truth that changes colors depending on the light? The nature of this disagreement goes a few millennia back in our intellectual history. The Greeks believed, well before Christ came to the world, by the way, the Greeks believed that they fell out of heaven, kind of got shoved out actually, fell to the earth, and the impact was so great that our perfect little souls were caught in the mud. See, this is mud, the skin stuff, this bone stuff. We're trapped in our bodies. They have this duality going. The physical is of this world, it's bad. Then there's the spiritual, and that's good. And the spiritual comes from the spiritual world. And in this world, everything is perfect. And I mean everything. Chairs are perfect. Tables are perfect. Ideas are perfect. And we know that what we're sitting in is a chair because it sort of resembles that perfect form that exists in the heavens. Very Platonic thinking, very absolute thinking. If you can, this is where we learn from the Greeks in the debate that if you can find one single little flaw in an argument, we have overthrown the argument. Because the argument, in order to be followed, has to be perfect. And if we can find a single flaw in the argument, then we have overthrown the entire argument. All this is coming from Greek rhetoric, Greek philosophers, hundreds of years before Christ was where all this stuff got established. So the Greeks have a truth that is. It's a little tricky to discern it. You have to argue, sometimes for lifetimes, to find that discerning process, but there is a perfect truth if we can just hunt it out. Now, we go from the Greek temple to the Jewish temple. What's their notion of truth? Well, we all think that we come down culturally from the Jewish tradition. We have this expression, Judeo-Christian. Like those are the same. Well, the Christians of Europe, the Roman Catholic Church, Rome is in Europe, keep that in mind. Roman Catholic Church, we bought into, the Christianity of Europe bought into the Greek idea of truth. Truth is something for most of European Christianity. But the Jews, they didn't think this way. This is one of the reasons that Bible study is an important thing, is because Jesus taught like a rabbi. Jesus was brought up in the notions of wisdom that were typical for Jews. My favorite expression or way of pursuing this is to say, which is true? Okay, if you're dealing in absolute Greek notions of truth, which is true? Look before you leap, or he who hesitates is lost. If I mention either of those, you'll probably say, yes, that's true. But when I give you both of them and ask you to pick, all of a sudden truth gets contextual. Well, if you're running blind in the night as fast as you can, trying to look before you leap might be a really handy thing, especially near the edge of a canyon. a sudden, look before you leap, and he who hesitates is lost, are in tension. And the rabbis would teach about life existing between this pole and this. Truth lies on a continuum between contexts. Yes, you want to look before you leap. Yeah, you don't want to look for very long if you're getting chased by a bear. And so truth is a squishy thing, caught in the context of the situation. If you follow not just Jewish, but basically Semitic, Arabic thinking, a big part of the world thinks that truth has something to do with the situation in which you're trying to apply it. And a great big part of the world thinks that truth has nothing to do with the context. It is what it is, and it never changes. Let's try this one. Water is liquid. Well, that assumes a lot. I know we have several engineering types, several educators in here, and water is liquid when it's warmer than freezing and cooler than steaming, or else water isn't liquid. Water is liquid is the truth based on a context. Oh, and you also have to assume it's on Earth. I was listening on NPR this morning. They've got this rover wandering around, trying to find water. Actually, it's trying to find evidence of water. Because what they know is they will never find water on the surface of Mars. Not anymore. Because if it was there, it would either freeze and evaporate away, or, well, I think that's what it would do. It would go away. And yet they're thinking that these shades of coloring that they're seeing under the dust on Mars that move around would be most easily explained by water under the surface, away from the pressures and temperatures of Mars that would cause water to evaporate and freeze away. So, context, 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 and yes, water is liquid most of the time in the world in which we live. We aren't that fond of the world where water is liquid. Opposed to this is the thinking that has Greek roots that I think is quite common and beloved in America, that truth is truth. And if you ever want to explain to me a situation in which my truth doesn't hold, then I will tell you that you're making excuses. How dare you give me sauce, is one expression, when the truth is obvious and evident, and we don't care much for excuses in the typical American context. And we built this into a lot of our movies, especially movies from the 50s. Especially Westerns. We like sheriffs that know what the truth is. And right is always right, even when there's temptations to do wrong. We love the simplicity. I love the simplicity. I grew up watching those. They were new movies then, as they were for some of us. But it was fun. It was fun to see right, do the right thing, and bring about the right outcome. Well, to mine. And these 30 or so tin pan miners trying to shake gold out of the stream. And at one point in the movie, the preacher, who is not what he appears to be, or at least he's a lot more than he appears to be, is invited for a drink by the bully industrialist to try and get him on his side of the truth. Even shows him this fake written document saying, all this land is mine. I have a right to it. And finally the argument devolves to this. The industrialist guy says, these people are standing in the way of progress. And the preacher simply responds, yours or theirs. So the Westerns, the very nectar of truth and right, started a few decades ago to be ambiguous. Truth for the miners, truth for the industrialist, started to move apart. Or there was this one. Luke is told that Darth Vader killed his father. Darth Vader tells Luke he is his father. Luke, using the Force in him, realizes that when Vader said, I'm your father, he was basically true. And then he wants to know from Obi-Wan, he says, now why'd you tell me that Vader killed my father? And Obi-Wan says, well, you know, kid, he's more machine than man. And anything that was your father was extinguished when he went to the dark side. Obi-Wan's into context. Vader's shopping absolute reality. There's a tension Luke has to live in between. So there's this tension between the America that knows truth to be singular and ultimate, and the America that knows truth to be contextual. And that tension is upon us today, and it's never upon us quite so much as in the days prior to an election. Thought I'd avoid controversy this morning by telling you all how to vote. Seriously, I'm not going there, but I might suggest to you how to think about it. How to think about voting as you go in. Because there is a big part of the struggle that is caught between truth being an absolute thing and truth being a contextual thing. And we're struggling with this as a country, and we have been for a long time. And the wave of one is set against the wave of another, and it washes back and forth. And we see it in our movies. And I'm not sure which way it's washing just now. I think that's why we're all a little puzzled over the outcomes of things. Because, well, one is outweighing the other at different times. We're busy trying to define the nature of truth. And we're missing the fact that truth will come out differently depending on whether you think it's something that is going to hold together despite circumstances, or whether you think truth is dictated by circumstances, and we all live in between. This is a Greek, Hebrew thing that's been going on for McCarthy held up that list of the communists that he knew to be in the State Department, we know with hindsight that it was a blank piece of paper that he actually held up as he testified before Congress. But as a good demagogue, he could declare that we were infiltrated. This had to be dealt with. Now, here's another definition. A demigod. This is an old Greek creature. A mythological being with more power than a mortal, but less than a god. And a person so outstanding as to seem to approach the divine. I think one of our challenges as modern people in this country is to concern ourselves with where those two cross. If the nature of truth is determined to be singular and ultimate, we're going to look for the one who can give us that truth. And truth being a spiritual thing, we will often look for the giver of the truth, of all truth, of that ultimate, penultimate truth, to be the guy who stands right where I'm standing. Wouldn't that be easy and slick if all you had to do was to find the giver of all truth, hire him, and you come on Sundays to pick up this week's bit. And that's when the demigod status starts to get assigned to a person. And the person is held to an expectation of near divine wisdom. Because after all, that's the one that's read the book. And the book is divine too, right? We want to believe that as well. Now, there's a problem. We all know it. You find the pastor in one church who says, I read the book. The book says is from God. It says this. This is divine, unchangeable truth. And it says X. We go down 2 blocks. We walk in that building. And there's a guy in there who says, I read the book. The book is from God. It's divine truth. And it says why. If our sense of truth is that it is ultimate and absolute, you just got to figure out what it is, then we shop for our demigod to become our demagogue, to dispense to us all truth, so that we know what to think. And what is that situation that brings? Because that means that when I walk out of my church believing my demagogue, and you walk out of your church believing your demagogue, there is no room for a discussion between us, is there? We have to fight it out, and all of a sudden, the new truth, which I might add is contextual, is might makes right. So whoever has the most power is the dispenser of truth at that moment. If, however, we go with the idea that truth is determined to be relative and contextual, then we are no longer going to be in a no-win situation where we can't talk because my demagogue says your demagogue is wrong. We can have a conversation. We can, if we stick with the notion of truth that we'll find in our Old Testaments, that we will find in the Gospels when Jesus is teaching, the kingdom of heaven is like. You know how much trouble we get into when somebody says the kingdom of heaven is X? kingdom of heaven is heaven. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like. It's a simile. It's a metaphor that Jesus gives us. There's room to talk about things. For centuries, millions have died fighting out whether we should baptize infants or not. That's what happens when you know what the kingdom of heaven is, instead of knowing what the kingdom of heaven is like. If you keep your truth to be relative, your conversation continues. If you don't, if your truth is absolute, your conversation ends and might makes right. So, do I like simple truth as much as you do? Don't we all like simple and true to stand next to each other? Absolutely. But it's not that simple, is it? We can go from what's right is right, Sheriff, on the right, to standing in the way of progress, yours or theirs, on the left. And you know where it all gets worked out so often is right where we are all this morning. America calls upon its churches to help find and define truth. So here we are, looking for truth to find our future. And we're in church. How shall we do it? There's this way. I give you a verse. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And you all know from that verse that truth never changes. It has no context. It's always and always absolute. Or I can say, Jesus is gentle. Let the little children come to me. Let's consider our gentle, unchanging God. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good things when you are evil? Not always so gentle. We could say, I've just discovered the church is no longer the source of truth. Let all run out of here and watch Face the Nation instead of coming to worship on Sunday morning. Or we could say, this requires thought. We need to think about this. Jesus comes to the temple, finds people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their table. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Unless your upbringing was different than mine, if you ever saw a picture of this, you saw Jesus with his whip of cords, and the money changers are making a beeline out of the temple. Turn your brain on. It's not obvious, but there's something there. Let's see it. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple. All of them. Who's them? Both the sheep and the cattle. people get driven from the temple. What gets driven from the temple is that which ought not to be there. The sheep and the cattle. There is something different to see if we use our minds, if we turn our brains on as we are going about the business of trying to follow our Lord. This isn't an isolated scripture. It happens again and again. There's an obvious interpretation, an obvious reading that makes it look like truth is something. And anything that isn't what it should be driven out en masse. But who gets driven out? It's even easier to Greek. I'm sorry. So I had an easy break. If you call learning Greek an easy break. But you can be sure this is it. This isn't a Krueger translation. Who got driven out of the temple according to this story? It's the sheep and the cattle. What got overturned? The tables. Who was there to listen to what Jesus had to say afterwards? Everybody, all the people. Some want to suggest to us that the truth is always plain and simple, and if it's complicated, it must be false. It must be just a ruse. It must be smoke and mirrors to cover a lie. And it's not true. A lot of things are complicated in life, even in the scriptures. Right is not always right. Wrong is not always wrong. I would love that simple truth. You would all love it too. Who wouldn't? There's always more to it. Let's just simply embrace the complexity of it. Let's say, you know what? I think God gave me this wonderful mind for a reason. And I am going to use every last neuron in following my Lord, in sorting out the complexity, in weighing one side against the other. I'm not going to cave in to the one who shouts the loudest that they know the truth. It's that easy. It's a phrase long. Do what I say. But I'm also not going to despair that truth cannot be found, because I've got a mind. You know, North Dakota farmers aren't famous for being the intellectuals of the land. And I ran into a guy who was just as plain as day. Never finished high school. I'm not sure if he started high school. And he said, you know, I love this church, Pastor. And I said, well, tell me, please. He said, because I don't have to leave my brain outside in order to come inside. I love that, man. We can find truth. We can sort out the conditions. And you know what? Water usually is liquid. And if it's not liquid, we're probably not outside talking about it. Jesus is gentle almost all the time. We can sort out the conditions, the circumstances, use our brains, and find truth, and find a way forward together, with everybody staying in the room. The only thing that leaves the room are the parts that ought not to have been there in the first place. It's the cattle that go. It's the money-changing tables that go. It's the sheep that go. The people stay in the room, use their brains, learn, teach, find unity. we get to believe true things, even if they're a little hard to tease out. And that's our great blessing. Keep your brains turned on, and the conversation